Hello, everybody. Happy spring. Almost spring, isn't it? Still officially winter, but not really here. It's so lovely. I am so pleased tonight to say that this is our first student lecture in the museum in Oglethorpe, to my knowledge. And I don't want it to be the last. In fact, we've got Antonio Mantica who will be speaking during the Atlanta Science Festival, talking about physics. So this is, something I'd like to make a regular part and parcel of what we do, part of our lecture series. I want to make a couple of quick notes that the lecture that should have started this series as part of the Azadi Edalat show has been rescheduled for the 22nd, and that is with Aziza Kahera, who is the COO of Aziza Magazine here in Atlanta. So that will be up here on the 22nd. There's some flyers about that. I promised Ruwa I wouldn't embarrass her, but I've got to say a couple things. Most of you here know her, but let's just say it again. Ruwa, because it's just wonderful. Ruwa Romman is exactly the sort of Oglethorpe student that an Oglethorpe student can be when they take advantage of this small community and understand their power as an undergraduate to make change happen. And I may not make you cry, but I may make myself cry, because it's rare that you understand that when you're that young, and that you really can also galvanize people and inspire them. But she's very charismatic, as you know, most of you, and uses her power for good and her charisma. And you're interning still now at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights, just opened here in Atlanta. Ruwa is a politics major and an English minor, and she refounded or founded Coexist, which is an interfaith community of students, which is a wonderful thing to have here, and is the president of the SGA, and she's a member of OVK, and I'm sure the list goes on, and as I was saying, she's probably saved kittens, and she does all kinds of good stuff. But, as I said, I'm just really, really happy to have students in the museum and talking about the museum. Take it away, Ruwa. Thank you.
Wow, so I walked in and I said, don't set the bar too high, and I think I'm just gonna, try to jump as high as I can. Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. I like to just kind of bring out that little southern drawl and say, good evening, y'all. And I hope you are having a wonderful evening. As Elizabeth mentioned, my name is Ruwa. And for those of you in the back, if you can't hear me, please let me know, and I'd be more than happy to raise my voice. People here know I can get pretty loud, so please just feel free to let me know. And let's talk. If you'll indulge me, my lecture is going to be very interactive, so if a question comes up, if you're confused about something, please raise your hand. So let's begin. I'm actually going to go ahead and start with a story, and hopefully that'll set up why I'm doing this. When I was in 8th grade, I moved to Forsyth County. For those of you not familiar with Georgia, it's a little bit north from here, very north from here. At the time when I moved there, I was the only non-white, or one of 3 non-white students in my entire 8th grade class. And I remember at the end of the year, one of the many comments, my 8th grade teacher came up to me, math teacher, and she said, I always assumed you would be the quietest kid, most, shy kid in the class. And you proved me wrong 5 minutes later. And, at the time I laughed it off. I was 12, 13 years old, and I didn't think about what that meant in the bigger picture as it relates to stereotypes, as it relates to who I am and my identity as a Muslim woman. And so, as I grew and time went by, I began to realize how much of people's perception of me falls into this category of a Muslim woman and what that meant to them. Because it turned out, as I grew older, I learned that what people saw of a Muslim woman was completely and totally different than what I had learned and experienced being a Muslim woman. So, if you don't mind going to the next slide. So what I learned through both growing up and then eventually when I joined the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Atlanta was that one of the most common misperceptions about Muslim women was that they were oppressed, they were submissive, they were veiled, illiterate, had no rights. And as you can see from the Google search that I did yesterday, I looked this up yesterday just to see if maybe Google had changed anything. this is what comes up. And I'd like to make a quick note here. This is in no way am I saying that a woman who chooses to wear, this is called a niqab, which is a face covering. I'm not saying in any way that this woman is illiterate or submissive or anything like that. All I'm saying is that's the perception of Muslim women. And it's so much more diverse than that. There are Muslim women that choose not to cover their head. There are Muslim women that choose to cover their hair. There are Muslim women that choose to only wear a loose shawl. I mean, there are so many different types of Muslim women. And the idea that they were being put into this box, to me, it's almost created this identity crisis at one point, because I was like, am I just not fitting certain standards? I mean, did I miss some sort of like lesson on how to be a Muslim woman like at some point in my life? And, did I skip that class? So it became very interesting. And so I began to learn as I grew up that that is not the case at all. And what I learned was that Islam as a faith empowers women. And as society, not a Muslim society, but society in general, there seemed to be this discrepancy between how we wanted women to be and how we empowered them to be. And so as I grew up, my mother, who's a stay-at-home mom, taught me that Islam, the faith, gave women a direct relationship to God. Something, at least in that region of the world, was unheard of. It made their roles in the family a central one rather than just, a person who gave birth, and that's pretty much it. And it brought them into the public sphere. Islam teaches that men and women come from the same origin, so it's not like women have less souls than men, or women are less creatures than men, or anything like that. And in fact, in the holy book, the Quran, which is the Muslim holy book, God tends to address, people as male and female. There's never a distinction, like only male, okay, you guys have this right, and only women have this right, and only, this sort of discrepancy. It's always, one of my favorite verses is, "O humankind, we created you from a single male and female, and made you into nations and tribes that you may know one another." This is actually one of my favorite verses. It's actually fueled my passion for coexist work, as well as my general, work interacting with people who are different than myself, for two reasons. One, it's true. We are such a diverse population. I mean, people in general, look at us. We are different colors, creeds, ethnicities, nationalities, identities, and the idea that God commands us not just as people, but directly as male and female. There's no, it's only one of you. To me, that's amazing. And this actually happens throughout the Quran. It's not like it's just one verse and it's, oh, this is amazing. Let's just focus on that out of context, like many people tend to do with my faith. It's actually throughout the book itself. And there's another verse, same idea. It says, males and females, there are characteristics and responsibilities of being Muslim, and these include, the concept of being devout, having patience, giving charity, being humble, guarding your chastity, things like that. And God promises rewards, not just for males, not just for men, but males and females. So for me, all my life, I grew up with this concept of men and women are equal. There's actually a hadith, which is what's called the sayings of the Prophet. So in Islam, you have the Quran, which is the holy book, and then the hadiths, which are the sayings of the Prophet that have been written down and sort of passed down in this sort of very rigorous academic tradition. And one of them states that men and women are twin halves of each other. So they're not one is slightly bigger, one is slightly less. No, we're twins. We are part of this one concept. And so it's amazing to me because growing up, that's what my mom always taught me. Now, granted, somebody comes from the Arab culture, the culture and the faith, yes, they intermingle a lot, but it's not necessarily that it's always implemented that way. So what ends up happening is, what I've noticed is, there's this sort of idealism in faith that society hasn't caught up with yet. But the note that always struck me was, is it a faith problem or is it a people problem? And the more I grow up, and the more I learn, and the more I interact with people, the more I realize that a lot of times these, societal problems that we like to blame on one culture, one faith, one color, one whatever, if you look at it and you open up the lens, you realize it's in almost every society and culture and faith. And what do all of those cultures, societies, and faiths have in common is that they're people. And it's a flaw of people and not necessarily a faith. And this, for a while, even until today, I'm what's called a third culture kid. So I was born in Jordan. I lived there for 5 years. I lived in Egypt for 2 years, and I came here when I was about 7.5, 8 years old. And I grew up here. I've spent the past 14 years of my life here. I consider myself a Muslim American. And for a lot of people, to them, when they look at me, they would see me, they'd ask me if I knew how to speak English. Hopefully my English is fine to y'all. Like, if you don't understand it, let me know. But I just always assumed up until that point, like, I speak English just fine. When I was 12 or 13, I had my fellow students ask me if I was married. No. What else? I mean, it's just so interesting to me to see, like, the way people saw me versus the way I saw myself. And there are these amazing traditions that I had grown up with, you know, the idea that, and I've come to learn as I grew up was, you know, we had so many Muslim women that were examples to women of faith, and they're from way back when up until today, and some of them are, you know, Aisha, and she had this beautiful love for knowledge, and she's actually one of the main narrators of over 2,000 prophetic hadiths. You know, and the idea that so much of the faith came from a woman, to me, is amazing. And it's also heartbreaking to see it because now it's so different. Another sort of example, Nusayba, she was known as an actual warrior who fought along with, you know, her male counterparts. It wasn't like, oh, women were relegated to just being nurses or whatever. No, she was right there on the front lines. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that female soldiers in the United States weren't allowed that option until about 2 or 3 years ago, and it was like this huge thing in the headlines. And for me, I grew up with this tradition that there shouldn't have been that difference. I mean, why was that difference? And so it's amazing to kind of see that. And even abroad here, or at least you know, abroad from here in the United States, there have been a lot of Muslim leaders, Muslim women leaders, but in the United States we haven't had a female president yet. So do you mind coming back? So as I mentioned, you know, it empowers women, defines their rights, encourages equality, gave women the right to marry as they choose, gave women the right to inherit, things like that. So just kind of a quick recap. And these are Muslim women who are heads of state. And this was actually really cool for me to learn, as I mentioned earlier, and actually I see Noor, she's my mentor back there. So I'm part of this amazing organization called the Islamic Speakers Bureau, which essentially goes around and teaches about a lot of these things. And as a Muslim woman, I had no idea about some of these people. You know what I mean? And these are women who are heads of their state. And you know, you see their pictures, you see their names, and you see the states they were, you know, heads of, or leaders of. And I look at here in the United States, and I'm like, I'm always told by people here that I'm oppressed, and I need to be liberated, and things like that. But then I look abroad, and I'm like, but why? It never made sense to me as a person, and as a woman. One more slide, please. And here in the United States, there are some notable American Muslim women. They are people who have taken leadership roles in the United States. They are in almost every aspect of society, from government to sports to foreign affairs, so you name it. So what I have a very hard time with, and to kind of really make this personal, is why the discrepancy? And I look, you know, a lot of people raise their hands and say, well, what about Saudi Arabia? What about countries that oppress women? And my question to them is always, is it the faith or is it the people that are doing this? You know, is it one specific giant umbrella of culture, or is it this sort of innate need to be in control? And so now as a third culture kid, as I mentioned, it's kind of interesting because I not only have to deal with, you know, merging East and West in my life, but also having to deal with kind of proving this sort of, yes, I am this sort of liberated, free woman, educated woman who's, you know, can articulate her thoughts very well and things like that, versus, you know, what society places on me both as a Muslim and a woman. And so sometimes, you know, I look at these women and I'm like, I kind of wish we paid attention to them. You know, I kind of wish that when I looked up that Google search, you know, when I typed in that Google search, this is what came up. Along with those women in niqab, by the way. I absolutely do not want anybody to walk away and go, yeah, well, that girl, she was wearing these beautiful colors and showed her face, and that's why she's liberated and not oppressed. You know, that's absolutely not what I want you to take away from this. What I want you to take away from this is, what I wear on my head or lack thereof, what I wear on my face or lack thereof, does not determine my intelligence, my ambition, my dreams and thoughts and hopes. It's actually who I am as a person. And that's why like perception in the media and things like that, I always talk about that for those who know me, because of this reason. Because if I'm walking down the street and I see somebody look at me like, oh, you poor thing, bless your heart, we've all heard that. Like, you know they're trying to be nice, they're trying to be thoughtful, but it's like, but why? Like, have you spent, even according to my teacher, all it takes is 5 minutes. Have you spent that 5 minutes with me to learn who I am? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is no. And so, and as I mentioned, unfortunately, culture and faith become intermixed. And you see a lot of women who are forced into marriages, sold, abused, and that's not Islam, by the way. That's not the faith. I'd like to point out that these issues exist in all faiths, cultures, and traditions. They have been, eradicated in some and continue to be a stubborn, evil force in others. And that just because a group of people take something and misappropriate it does not make it part of that faith. Obviously, a really good example of that is ISIS right now. Granted, it doesn't relate to Muslim women, but one of their biggest sort of recruitment efforts has been, oh, here's the role of women in our culture, and here's how it works, and this is it, and that's it, and it's rigid. And it's, again, crazy to me because I've learned Islam to be this beautiful faith that has a lot of schools of thought and a lot of traditions and things like that. And for Muslim women in general, I feel like we're at a crossroad. For women in general, we're at a crossroad. We're beginning to finally have our voices heard in a way that I feel like hadn't been done before. I feel like we are at this point where we can either pave our path or let others pave it for us. And I feel like this is sort of the time for women and Muslim women in general to learn about their rights. And in the case of Muslim women, I believe them to be their God-given rights. And I believe that Islam teaches them to be their God-given rights. And as I mentioned, for a third culture kid like myself, it's been very difficult. My parents obviously were born in Jordan, raised there for 30 years, and what I expect of my life and some of my rules and restrictions might be a little different than theirs, simply because I'm growing up in a different environment than them. But that's also totally normal, because that's a generational divide. That's not just, oh, my culture is oppressive and my faith is oppressive. Obviously there is a difference between Eastern culture and Western culture, but it's not just about oh, it's just Arabs, they're so backwards and so bad and things like that. So now I'm looking at my life. I graduated in May. I'm a senior now. And one of the things I always have to think about is not only where do I want to go, but as somebody who always worries about, how are people going to see something, where do I want to go and do for the rest of my life? What difference can I make so that women who are in my shoes now don't feel like they have to put in 3 times as much work to get to where somebody else might have to go. I've been very lucky, I would like to point out, that I have not had to, I joke around about the harassment that I face in Forsyth County, but I know for a fact it's nowhere near some of the harassment that other women in general, but Muslim women have faced in other places. I consider myself lucky to be in a place, especially in college, that is so accepting versus my high school experience. But unfortunately, not a lot of women have that same luck. I learned today during the career fair, from the Women's Foundation, it's only 51% of students in Georgia graduate high school. Only 51%. And so many of those are women. And unfortunately, the cycle of poverty is one of the most oppressive to women, because they're the ones who end up with little kids to take care of, and they're the ones who end up with this sort of extra responsibility, and they can't move forward, and they can't be empowered. And for me, it's well, that's not even a faith issue, that's a women issue. That's not even a culture issue, that's a society issue. And my hope and my ambition is that one day we learn to take away these arbitrary lines and realize that for us, the problems we face are problems that everybody faces. And for women especially, is that it's not just because I'm a Muslim woman that I face these problems, but that a woman just like any other woman. And I'd like, if I was to have an audience much like yourself, I'd love to say to them, and I'd love to say to you, don't look at me as just my veil and just my culture and just sort of this baggage that I carry with me, but sort of look at me as the person that I am and the ambitions that I have, because chances are we're a lot more similar than we think we are. I'd like to actually open it up for questions because I saw somebody earlier kind of raise their hand and kind of put it back down. And I know you don't want to interrupt me, and I would prefer questions. So please ask them to me, because I could talk on literally for hours about sort of oppression of women in general, but also misconceptions. So please, yes.
My experience is way out of date, but when I lived in the Middle East, I've noticed a major difference in the culture between different countries and the empowerment that the women had, like in Kuwait or Bahrain, Jordan, compared to some of the others where they were completely stymied, Saudi Arabia certainly, and others. And I wonder if I've been away for many years. Has that changed? I mean, is Saudi still pretty strict with, for example, a woman couldn't drive a car in Saudi Arabia unless she was on the Aramco compound. They couldn't teach, they could teach school and they could be nurses, but they couldn't be secretaries. They had men secretaries. Now that was the culture that was forcing them into those stereotypes. Is that still the case?
So I'm going to actually speak to this as a sort of politics major rather than, Muslim woman, because I don't have like some sort of authority on everything. But I wish I did. But yes, that is still the case. And I'd like to point out, again, that there is no religious basis. The point for me to say is there's no religious basis for oppression.
Yeah, I understand that.
Yeah, so it's definitely, but if you look right now, what's changed, however, is that now you have women sort of fighting against the ban to drive, sort of fighting for their space in society, fighting for their literally God-given right due to education. The more they learn about their faith, the more they realize, wait a minute, maybe that's not so much the case. Maybe that something is being used that I cherish and care very much about in order for somebody else to get their way. So there have been movements, obviously, to drive, movements to kind of work in some of those areas, such as business, such as government. And I believe there are now women in government in Saudi Arabia. I remember reading an article about it several times.
I lived in Kuwait at the time,
yeah.
And the women, that was 30 years ago, and the women
right.
were pretty salty even then.
Yeah. I would like to just point out that I haven't heard that phrase in almost 6 months, and that's great. Yes, they are very salty, but I would like to turn that phrase into very fed up. They are very over kind of being treated the way they're treated. And I kind of see that. I see that in the conversations that are happening between Muslim women. So on my Facebook page, I've got friends, in Jordan, friends everywhere. And I've seen the conversation go from, what are we allowed and what are we not allowed to do, to why have we not moved into that sector yet? How can I break into that male-dominated sphere? I'd also like to point out that's a conversation happening here in the United States in a lot of different fields as well. So it's not just, Saudi Arabia or Kuwait or whatever. Yeah, there are certain aspects that are worse there, but I would argue there are still certain aspects of that here and everywhere else. Please.
What would you suggest that we can all do to be kind of ambassadors after this discussion? Because I think that would be an amazing thing. And I love that when I first spoke to you, you said, I'm not Persian. Yes, I know it's all these cultural pieces, and Muslim is not. And, but I certainly have a learning curve here. I try my best if I hear something that's ignorant or oppressive to direct people, but I might not know it myself. So I think, well, look at the Aleph website, or maybe you should go to XYZ, and you have ideas.
So a few ideas, actually. Thank you for asking that. The first is I keep plugging in the Islamic Speakers Bureau because I'll be honest with you, I've been exposed to that organization since I was in 7th grade. I'm now a member. And what they do is amazing professional work. You go to their website and you say, hey, I'm part of this church, I'm part of this class, I'm part of this whatever. And you say, I want a presentation on the Muslim faith and the practices and traditions, or I want a presentation on Muslim women in America, which is in fact where I got these facts and these pictures. I want information about you name it, they'll even tailor presentations for you. And we're trained. I mean, we have to go through trainings, we have to go to meetings, and I know I haven't gone to any, so Lord, please don't hurt me. But so that is how, that's actually one of the biggest things, is if you have a group of people that have never been exposed to a Muslim person before, introduce them to one. The second one is, I implore you that if you read something, think twice before sharing it and check your sources. And I say this because, I can't believe it's been like over a month. But over a month ago, 3 young Muslim people were shot and killed in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. And I remember, you hear about shootings and killings all the time. Unfortunately, I didn't really think much of it when I first got the headline. And then the more I learned about them, the more I realized they're me. Their life, I mean, they were going to college, they were my age. And, to imagine sort of what they did in their communities, sort of their friends, their families. I mean, it was literally like these people that were living my life were suddenly gone and attacked. And when somebody says it was over a parking dispute, I'm like, no, don't say that. Don't say that, because you can't say that. But part of me thinks that what contributes to that kind of violence and that kind of hate is when you take a whole group and you say, those people are that way. So my second point is, before you hit that share button, think about it. Is it true? And why do you think it's true? And why are you more likely to believe the bad about an entire group of people than the bad about, society, or the bad about, a bad thing that's happening? So that's thing number 2. And thing number 3 is, if you have a question, at this point, especially veiled Muslim women are so used to being approached at like the supermarket and like, you name it, anywhere we go, we're so used to being approached about questions. Me personally, I'd much rather you ask me a question that you think will come off as ignorant than for you to think that something is wrong. And I hate Google. I mean, that's a perfect example right there, because I've seen some nasty things on Google about my faith that aren't true. And so for me, those are kind of the top 3 things. Yes.
Okay. Ruwa. I grew up in a small town up in Tennessee, and there were plenty of Christian groups, plenty of different churches, and a lot of them would say, this group, women are not allowed to ever cut their hair. Women are not allowed to wear makeup. Women must never wear pants, or definitely not shorts. And so, I grew up thinking that those kind of groups that force women to dress a certain way or wear their hair a certain way are oppressing women. So, and you've talked about how it says in the Quran that men and women are equal, there's twins. Can you explain to me why, when you pull up on Google, you really don't see much about Muslim men and what they're traditionally, asked to wear? Can you talk a little bit about your personal experience, where you got to feeling comfortable about what you wear versus what other women choose to wear, and kind of the historical significance of that?
Yeah, so this is called a hijab, by the way. You can also call it a scarf. And I started wearing it in 6th grade. Now, the funny story behind that is the reason I chose 6th grade was because you're going from elementary school to middle school. It's a whole new experience. For me, it was like, oh, clean page, clean cut. I was doing the whole college thing before college. And I remember my mom looking at me. She was like, don't do that. I'm like, but why? Like, you look pretty in it. I want to do that. And she was like, don't do it. You're too young for this. And I'm like, well, now I want to do it. And yeah. And honestly, I was at that point in my life where my mom, I feel so bad for my mom sometimes, because I am so headstrong and I want to pave my own path, and she's just kind of like, well, just do it this way. And I'm like, no. And it's funny because she doesn't know this, but the reason I started wearing it, or at least I think I've told her a few times, is she is the most generous woman I know. I mean, we will drive each other crazy like any mother and daughter will, but her selflessness to me is amazing. And at times it's like, yeah, she's your mother, she expects things of you, and there is that sort of I want this for me and my daughter. But what she's given up, I mean, she came here at 30-something, not know the language, not know anything. Instead of sort of going out and working and perfecting her English, she stayed at home to make sure we knew Arabic, but to also tutor us in our studies. I cannot begin to imagine making that kind of sacrifice. I mean, I'll be honest, I think I'm too selfish to do that. And it started out that way. And in 7th grade, I was so sick of my friends, making fun of me, saying, why are you wearing that thing? The locker room was a nightmare because it was like, oh, your hair's so pretty, because, all girls, so I don't have to wear it in front of them. Your hair's so pretty, why do you wear that thing on your head? It makes you look so ugly. And, as a 7th grader, you want to, fit in and be pretty and whatever. And she was like, well, you put it on, you made that commitment. Because that's what it is, it's a commitment. And it's an expression of faith, and it's an expression of spirituality. And as I've grown older, my scarf has meant different things to me. So obviously when I was younger, it was to emulate my mother. And as I grew older, it was an expression of my religious beliefs. And it's a reminder of the expectations that I have both for myself and the expectations that God has for me. And as an imperfect human being, that consistent reminder is nice to have. It can be daunting, but it's nice to have. So that's kind of been my journey with my scarf. It's funny because when I moved to Forsyth County, which is supposed to be the less accepting one, is where I became more firm in my decision to wear my scarf. It became sort of my way of rebellion against society, like, oh, you want me to be a certain way? Well, you know what? I'm not going to be that way, and I'm going to do it right. I'm going to do this world right. I make mistakes along the way. Everyone who knows me knows that I've got my own flaws, but at the same time, it's not me saying I'm perfect, it's me saying I'm trying to be. So, yes.
Could you expound on that a little bit? I guess what I have a hard time reconciling is you see a country like Saudi Arabia, and you see the burqa. And being non-Muslim, it's almost a symbol of oppression in my mind. This is how Muslim men want Muslim women in that country to dress. And I look at the headscarf, the hijab, and say that's on the continuum between, the hijab and the burqa. And if it's oppression here, how does it switch to something that's not oppression as you go through, whether you cover your eyes, whether you cover everything, whether you just cover your hair or just wear a shawl? And I guess that's where, I look at it and can't reconcile the two things, seeing how horribly the women are treated in Saudi Arabia, and I feel are oppressed because of the restrictions, and it may not be religious restrictions, but religion is used as the excuse to place those restrictions on women in Saudi Arabia.
So I like to make a joke that that my scarf is not restrictive to me the way heels are restrictive to me. I don't like heels. And that's kind of, for me, a way of saying that oppression comes in a lot of different ways. And it's a lighthearted way to do it, but really, I see oppression, for example, in the workplace of women not hitting that glass ceiling. How is that any different than a man? And being told, well, you're not really qualified for that position. And but by using company standards and company expectations. So to me, how is that any different than somebody coming along and saying, I believe that you should dress this certain way, and here's how you're supposed to do it. And I know religion is something that is, especially Islam, is being misused consistently, but I could throw that at almost any faith. And I really can. If you look at, I'm really uncomfortable talking about other faiths and traditions, but there are extremists in every faith. So in Burma right now, there are extremist Buddhists who are slaughtering Muslim citizens. And you never think of Buddhists as being violent. You never think of Buddhism as being violent. And it's not. I don't believe the philosophy itself to be a violent philosophy, but I see people misusing that faith to commit atrocious acts. And I see this concept as no different. Because for me, having to wake up in the morning, I just don't wear makeup because I choose not to wear makeup. It actually makes me break out all the time. But, how is that any different than somebody who has to wake up an hour and a half earlier to do her hair and dress up and dress a certain way and meet society expectations and wear really uncomfortable heels and things like that, that I believe get in the way of her self-expression. So it really is a difference of how you identify expressing yourself. Now, do I think that there's a problem in Saudi Arabia when it comes to the treatment of women? I absolutely do. And the majority of Muslim women that you talk to will tell you the same. But even women in Saudi Arabia will tell you, well, it's not all that bad. Because then you get a chauffeur that has to drive you around. And then you get, all of these, seriously, I was taught, my mom's friend lives in Saudi Arabia right now. She goes, yes, it drives me nuts that I can't drive, and there are women trying to change it, and blah, 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 blah. But it's so nice not having to drive anywhere. It's not an excuse, but it's one of those things that, kind of says, and I have to do this too, is I can't keep vilifying something like Saudi Arabia when there are oppressions happening everywhere.
But that doesn't necessarily make it right.
Right, and I'm not saying that.
Being, seeing a glass ceiling or saying
Right.
in American business, women have to dress this way, doesn't make it right.
Right.
It might be that that's oppressive also.
And I would never say it's right, and that's my point, is I don't think it's right. And a lot of Muslim women don't think it's right. But at the same time, for a lot of Muslim women, that niqab is an expression of faith to them. So I remember one time I was watching CNN, and there was an Egyptian female activist and another female activist who was wearing a niqab. So one of them wasn't wearing a scarf, wasn't wearing anything. In fact, she was wearing like a strapped tank top or something. And they were both speaking. And I remember like when the woman who was wearing the face covering started speaking, for a second the interviewer seemed kind of taken aback because she was so like forceful about her faith and her rights and what she chooses. And finally she said, places like Saudi Arabia make my expression of faith so much more difficult. Because she has to work like 5 times as hard to prove that she's not being oppressed because of this expression that she chooses to make. So it's really interesting how that happens because it kind of ruins it for everybody else. Like if I was to ever choose to wear a niqab, like I would feel bad about it because I'm like, falling into the stereotype that everybody put on me. But whose fault is that stereotype? It's the same people trying to impose it on me. So it's really interesting. But sorry, go ahead.
No, this is amazing. Because we've got so many different things going on here. You're talking about faith, and it's a completely separate issue, politics, but interwoven, and in various cultures. Obviously you're not from Saudi Arabia, but this keeps coming up because this is our go-to. But then this obvious thing I feel like I have to say is the fetishizing of women in cultures for centuries.
And then the sixth concept that we have to worry about.
Right, exactly. So the notion that, it's just horrifying that we're all showing our ankles now, in the 19th century. Now we're getting rid of our corsets. Oh my God, this is horror. And then to a much lesser degree for men. Oh, this gentleman's not wearing a hat, how uncouth. But it's mostly about focus on women, so it's more of a women's issue. But why is it always about the clothes? But it is so often, and I think it's because of fetishizing women in culture.
And I'd like to just make a quick point too, is that's actually why I made a point to say, not all women who wear a face covering are oppressed, but that doesn't mean it's not used as a form of oppression. So that's what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is my intent is to bring across that not only are there different forms of oppression, but misappropriation takes certain expressions of faith away from those same women that want to, choose to, rather than being forced to express themselves that way.
That's the operative word, is choice.
Yeah. And it comes down to, and it's funny because there is actually a verse in the Quran that states, there's no compulsion in faith. You can make somebody wear a face covering, and you can make men grow out their beard, and you can make, children do this, and you can make somebody memorize the entire Quran, and they can believe that there is no such thing as God. We literally, this faith tells its believers, you cannot control people's hearts, nor can you know what's in them. And that for me is the most outstanding thing, is that there are people, as you mentioned in Saudi Arabia, but all around the world, who pretend they know God's word and say, okay, I'm going to not only impose it on you, but use it to keep you from, let's be honest, being a competition to me. Right now, women, especially female students, are surpassing their male counterparts in the classrooms. More women are graduating from college now than ever before and will soon surpass their male counterparts. So, I'll just leave that out there. Women in Saudi Arabia do get an education. Back in the 1200, during the Ayyubid period of Damascus in 1174 to 1260, 26 religious endowments were built by women. So this was happening in the Middle East almost 1,400 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, a little less.
You said 1260?
Yes.
Yeah, during the period that Europe was in its dark ages, countries that practiced Islam were doing things like inventing the idea of a hospital, or incredible things were happening.
So my point isn't to say that it's okay and Islam had its good days. I'm just saying it's not faith, it's people. And it's funny because one of my mentors always says, she's like, people are people are people. And that really is what it comes down to. And I'd love for people to, and as I mentioned earlier, if you want to be an advocate both for me, but also my faith and this group that I identify with, is kind of remind your fellow men and women to remember that. Yes, systemic oppression absolutely exists, but the causes behind it, I don't think they're religious. Sorry.
How about just being an advocate for humanity?
I agree, absolutely. I am, as I mentioned, I was one of the founders of Coexist Oglethorpe here on campus, and one of the first conversations we had was on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. And the conversation obviously was about extremism and violence, and why is it okay to kill people by their faith? And I remember looking at the person asked, and I said, it's not. You know, it's that simple. But how many times have you seen religious institutions being taken over by political actions, and sometimes for good? A really good example of that is civil rights movement. You know, it was inspired by faith. But a bad part of it is people like ISIS who purport to be inspired by faith. And by the way, I speak Arabic, and I've seen some of their videos, and I would like to point out that the amount of out of context you have to do to be able to do what they do is kind of incredulous. But that's not why we're here today. Yes, Dr. Woods.
Could you maybe share with us a little bit about how you have found the experience as an intern at the Civil Rights Museum in terms of some of these issues we're talking about?
So one of the things I noticed, so the Civil Rights Museum is three parts. There's the first floor, which is just the King papers. So it's like the museum-esque that you typically see. There's a moving exhibit right now. It's a Gaia mural. Before it was a bunch of paintings. The second floor is the actual civil rights movement, very interactive place. And the third floor is human rights. One of the most unique things about this space is it focuses on women of the civil rights movement, some of them I'd never heard of before, and it highlights women around the world. And it's amazing to me, there's actually one entire video just on women and girls. And to see what they experienced your typical, poverty, everything that humanity experiences, twofold. And right now, for me as a Muslim specifically, it's been very interesting to see kind of people from my community come through and go, I can learn so much from this, for what I'm going through. And it really does reinforce this idea that we as people do go through so many of the same things. Again, this idea of advocating for humanity in general, because we all go through the same things at some point in our lives. You mentioned the Dark Ages of Europe. I would argue this is the Muslim civilization's Dark Ages. I would argue this is part of that cycle that happens throughout history. As a politics major, somebody who's been very interested in history, I believe history repeats itself in a very strange, serendipitous way. And being there, seeing some of these people, it's interesting because they come from everywhere. And a lot of them do put on that stereotype of me. One of them asked me if I spoke English. They're like, your English is so good. And I'm like, you're at the Civil Rights Museum. Like, please give me a break. Like, come on. So you see people from all around the world that have come through as well. And some of them love talking to me, and some of them are scared to talk to me, and it's interesting. I've never seen myself as somebody with sort of a dominating stance or personality, but apparently I can be scary to some people. And that to me is scary because I'm like, why? But that's kind of been, I've learned a lot from there. I mean, how can I not?
I think the people that meet you, that you're very articulate, you explained well that you have chosen to dress the way you do. But people who meet you don't know that. They may think you're part of this culture where this has been dictated to you.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a misconception.
And if you notice, a lot of these problems that we're talking about, what do they fall back on? Education. Women not knowing what their rights are because they were never educated on what those rights are. Men not knowing what those rights are because they were never educated on their expectations of making sure those rights stay for those women, by the way. There is that responsibility on men. And this concept of, I don't know, for me, it's crazy. But at the same time, I've seen some of my friends who feel pressured by the culture around them to dress a certain way, and not necessarily hijab. I mean, I've seen it in my community, but I've seen it outside my community. And again, people are people are people. So.
Well, if you become a member of certain organizations, they expect you to dress certain ways. as an example, the Roman Catholic nunnery, recognize those. Many don't do it today, but it is a culture choice by those people that join that particular organization.
And actually, Mike mentioned earlier, it's a spectrum. So for some Muslim women, to them, modesty is how you act versus how you dress. And for some Muslim women, it's dressing a certain way, but not necessarily covering your face. And for some Muslim women, the best expression of modesty to them is in fact a full covering. So really, I mean, like you mentioned, organizations expect certain things, but I think in this case, because of Islam's ability to be open to interpretation, and I'd like to add within reason, of course, because there is a context to everything, allows for that plethora of expression, allows for that ability to make it personal to some degree. So, and for those who continue to say, you have to do this, you have to dress a certain way, I always ask them, well, aren't you doing more harm than good by forcing them to do something and potentially pushing them away from something they could be inspired by? I mean, let's be honest, like if somebody had come to me and said, you have to wear this and you have to do it a certain way, I would have probably not done it. Or I would have been so oppressed by it because it's destroying my self-expression that I would have grown up hating it. I mean, that really, especially my generation, that's how we work. I mean, if you make us hate something, we'll hate it with a passion. Thankfully, I've been, raised to hate violence and oppression, but, some people miss that chapter. Yes.
So you just said a plethora of expression. I think implicit in this general conversation is an acceptance of a gender binary. And we talk about men doing this and women doing this. How do you see Islam responding to a movement away from a gender binary, and as at least particular parts of American culture in general being more accepting of a gender spectrum?
So Islam is, well, not, I don't want to say the faith, I want to say the institution hasn't dealt with that yet. And what I mean by that is there hasn't been like a movement from the Muslim community going, let's redefine gender. Because for the most part, it's sort of this idea of, the idea of gender expression is slightly different in the Muslim community. That's not saying that there aren't Muslims who have dealt with that, and that's not saying that that conversation isn't happening. I'm just saying it's in its infancy, to the point that even I'm not capable of saying, here's the ruling on that.
Sure.
Because a lot of scholars haven't even said, like, here's the ruling on that. I mean, we all know that there are people who are born with, let's just look at the biology itself, like people born with different biological aspects that they don't really fit on one side or the other. So it's really interesting to see that. I haven't, my friend actually took a class on the concept of sexuality and gender in Islam. I haven't taken it, so I can't talk about it, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I just, even if we figured out what men and women get to do, then we're stuck choosing to be one or the other.
Well, if you're talking about roles, like should they be at home? Are they obligated to do this? Are they obligated to do that? We were joking, my family and I were sitting around one time, and my mom was scrolling through Facebook, and there was this scholar, and he was like, so the idea of marriage is a contract between two consenting adults. And he was talking about how women tend to be the people who have to clean and cook and do all of that, and men are the breadwinners and whatever. And he's like, actually, women can sit at home and do absolutely nothing, and unless she's been mandated to do that work, then she doesn't have to. Like, unless you previously agreed upon that, she doesn't even have to cook and clean and do whatever, even if she's not the breadwinner of the family. So I could just sit at home and do nothing if I wanted to, which I'm not, but, it's that very interesting concept of what is the role of society. Now, the Prophet's wife, for example, she was a businesswoman, but she was also the mother of his children. So it's, like I said, I've never thought of the idea of a woman being allowed to be something and not something else. Obviously, my parents have different expectations of what they would prefer for me to be. Like, my dad really wants me to be a doctor, and I'm like, I hate medicine. Yeah. That's my conflict with my father right now. So, and I'm about to graduate. But you know what I mean? Like, that's how that works. Yeah. Yes, Dr.
You talked about your attitude toward Google. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, as a young person, the social media and how it fits into this discussion, you talked about the contact you have with many people and women and all over the world.
Yeah, so Twitter's fun. Twitter does this thing where they do hashtags and people get like really into it, and there's always sarcastic comments. And one of them was, I think it was Newsweek had released an article about Muslim rage. This was when the cartoons first were published. This was before Charlie Hebdo, for any of that. And they ignored like all these scholars that came out and said, yes, we believe in freedom of expression, but we also believe in respect. They ignored all of them, and they found like one of the scariest looking Muslim, I think they're Muslim people in the world, put them on the front page and wrote Muslim rage. And I went on Twitter that day, and there were a few really funny examples. One of them was they changed the front picture from Muslim rage to an actual like rage party from a club, and like put like Muslim rage on that. One of them, somebody made a hashtag like, I left my umbrella in the car and it's raining outside, like hashtag like Muslim rage. And the whole point of it for somebody who's Muslim is it's an outlet for us to say, this is ridiculous. You know, I see people on social media sharing like, you know, ISIS believes this and ISIS believes that, and I'm like, okay, great, so what are you doing about it to denounce that? Or I've had people ask me like, what do you think about this? And I'm like, well, as an authority to the 1.2 billion Muslims around the world, let me, you know, speak on behalf of these people. I'm not, but it's frustrating. But at the same time, if I choose to engage, and that's always a choice, by the way, I always have to decide if I'm going to engage or not. I need to not make it personal, because once I make it personal, it's over. And I always try to, as Eli was saying earlier, it's like it's a teachable moment. And my entire life has been, do I get angry and do I get upset and do I cry, or do I make it a teachable moment? Now, granted, this was a lot more lighthearted, like, oh, do you shower with that thing on your head? And I'm like, no, this is a teachable moment. But, you know, it's a little more difficult in this aspect when people say your faith is violent. When the Jordanian pilot, for example, was burned alive. I mean, for me, it was like, what better example do you need to know that these people are just evil and not a part of one culture or one faith or one religion? The first people they executed were either Muslim converts or nonprofit workers helping out, you know, refugees. So if they're willing to do those if they're willing to do those to allies to supposedly their cause, which they always say, we're fighting for the Arab population, we're fighting for the oppression of the Arab world, we're fighting for the oppression of the Muslim world, then why are the majority of your victims Muslim? And why did you execute one of your, like, you know, Islamic scholars the other day? Unfortunately, that doesn't capture ratings. Unfortunately, that's not as shareable when you see this, like, scintillating headline, oh, my friends are gonna like this a lot more than Muslim people are really peaceful and they, like, cleaned up a highway the other day. You don't hear about that.
I was in Senegal when Charlie Hebdo happened.
Mm-hmm.
Senegalese President Macky Sall, who is Muslim, made the decision very quickly to go to Paris and participate in that march of some 50 leaders of state.
So, you know, as I mentioned, it's not, you know, the Palestinian leader was there. The leader of the Palestinian Liberation Organization was there. I'd like to also point out that the same people who tend to vilify, whether you agree with their politics or want to condemn them, people like Hezbollah were like, this is not even my faith. Like, I'm not even going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. Literally, they were like, that is not okay. Going in and killing people in their jobs is not okay. This is not a place for battle. So, yeah. Any more questions?
You know, you talk about the ISIS killing people. To me, their worship contribution to the future is their killing the museums and the artifacts that cannot be replaced and have not been studied enough to know really what our past was.
And that to me is heartbreaking, because I've always been taught that you're supposed to seek knowledge. There's a saying, I'm not sure if it's an authenticated hadith or just a common Muslim saying, but it's seek knowledge from the cradle to the grave. And the concept is that we're in this world to learn and be the best that we can be. And the fact that you're willing to go and destroy museums and history, and it's not even bad history, some of it is like manuscripts, as Elizabeth mentioned, of like these hospitals that were being built and these medical contributions that the Muslim world made. Sometimes I just think they're just very angry people that managed to get a really bad clip together. That really is how I see them.
Well, you also mentioned things happening in cycles, perhaps, in some areas in the Muslim world, this is a bit of a dark ages. But let's look at the Christian Crusades and how bloody those were at one time, In the name of faith, people can do horrible things. But, one thing that's resounding to me is, and it's something I already knew, but it's to the fore of my mind, is that how someone chooses to express themselves and in a connection to their faith requires strength. Whether you're heading into a convent or whatever you're doing, if it's a reflection of who you are, and it's devotion.
Yeah, so there was I completely forgot it. There is a very interesting, my teacher used to always say that feminists have a very hard time with Muslim women. And it's for this specific reason, is that we choose to cover up, whereas, there is this concept of feminism that you can choose to wear what you want to wear. Well, if I choose to cover up, then why is that not an acceptable form of expression? It's very interesting, it's very interesting to, as you mentioned, there are certain standards and expectations, and it's like, well, I consider myself a Muslim feminist, although granted I think that's redundant, but I do.
I think sometimes it's the choice to cover up might have grown from a man's inability to look at a woman without lusting.
Yeah.
And, because of that, we've got to have them in full burqa looking through mesh because we can't control ourselves. And that's the genesis of it.
Right, no.
And so when we see somebody making the choice, it's that, but it grew from something that may not have been proper.
So there's a story that I learned recently, and again, you've got to understand, narrations about the Prophet's life, are volumes long. So I'm always, learning these fun little tidbits. So the Prophet, and I believe it was his cousin, were walking in the market, and his cousin kept staring at this woman who had a very beautiful face. And the Prophet, he didn't go up and, tell the woman, hey, you need to cover your face, you're too pretty. He held his cousin's face and turned it away and said, remember, you have to lower your gaze. So there is this concept of equal responsibility. So if I choose to dress a certain way, that's not my fault if you keep staring at me. It's on you whether or not you choose to lower your gaze. I mean, there is, somebody mentioned, somebody asked a question about what are the responsibilities of Muslim men. Yeah, they don't have to wear a headscarf, but they can't keep staring at another woman no matter how provocatively she's dressed. Because I can't control your actions just like you can't control mine. And your decisions to do something are your own rather than my fault. And this actually goes into this concept of, I always like to say, instead of teaching women self-defense classes and carrying around a rape whistle and having the pepper spray and, not to go out at certain times or whatever, yes, you have to take precautions. Even men in general. I mean, I had, one of my friends was walking back from the store and he got mugged, but he's a guy. But at the same time, wouldn't it be so much easier to just teach men, hey, respect women and don't, rape? So, I mean, it really is, there's a shared responsibility in society. And I think there's wisdom behind the concept of maybe somebody doesn't believe in the headscarf, but at least they believe in the concept of mutual responsibility. So again, if you choose to attack me, that's your choice. But at the same time, the Prophet turned his face away. He didn't make the woman cover up. That to me speaks volumes. Yes?
Can I just add a little comment, please? My
Yeah.
name is Ruwa Romman. Friend, she likes to call me mentor, but not really.
She really is.
I learned from you today, girl. Just to answer your question about the Islamic dress code when it comes to women. This is not necessarily, and I can totally see your point. You were talking about the momentum, and you just see this headscarf as an extension, basically, of the whole full covering. At the end, when Muslim women choose, and I think choice is the key word, when Muslim women choose to dress, they're not referring to some standards that men put or lay for women to dress. At the end, their frame of reference is the scripture. And in the scripture, it does indicate that, yes, men and women both should dress modestly and behave modestly, but it also talks about a general head covering, does not mention the face, and it talks about, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that it's not women abiding by or following some rule that men put for them. It's referring to their frame of reference, and that is the Quran. And I think what's really important, other than choice, there was another point that I was trying to mention, maybe it's going to come up later, But that is, we as women, and I can talk from my personal experience, which Ruwa also very eloquently talked about, is that we as women who choose to cover, yes, we do face challenges, but we also see the benefit of it. We feel it. Like I had a presentation today, and it was an all-male room, and they grilled me, talking about the headscarf and talking about, well, don't you feel oppressed? And she talked about it beautifully. Is that yes, even if I choose to dress in a different way, I would still feel that I need to abide by certain rules, social norms, in order to fit in somehow. This, I feel, this is my expression, this is my experience, might not be every Muslim woman's experience with it, but this is mine, that it does liberate me. I do not feel that I need to indulge or be part of this when we see this. This is not the most politically correct word, okay? This madness about body image.
Yeah.
I do feel that this liberates me out of it, and I'm just not part of it.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to share that.
That really is part of it too. Like the amount of times that I've had to worry about whether or not like something is form-fitting enough rather than does it look presentable, that relief is amazing. You know, the idea that I know for a fact that what I earned isn't because some guy found me attractive versus I worked hard for it and I earned it. Not by my looks, maybe by my charm. Some people say I'm charming. I don't really know why. Some people say that. But you know, I'd like to believe. That was great. But I'd like to believe that it's because, you know, I worked hard for it and not because I looked a certain way. And as I mentioned, it really is such a personal experience that it's so difficult for me to give you definitions and, you know, this is it and this is, but that's my point. My point is that it is so unique to each person, and that all I ask of each of you and myself, that I give every woman, no matter how she chooses to dress, whether she's covering or not, that space to express herself. Because that's what it comes down to. The idea that I feel like this scarf has liberated me is actually encouraging me to find a way to liberate other women and provide them that free space to be able to express their liberation the same way that I've been given the opportunity to. And that really is what it comes down to. Now, I know we're running low on time. I'm going to stay here, but I know for some of you that have to go and just don't want to offend me, please. But I'll be here, and I'll take like 1 or 2 more questions, and then is that okay?
We'll keep the museum open for about another 15 minutes after the talk, so you can wander about.
Yeah.
More informally.
Thank you. So any last minute questions? Anything before we wrap up? Yes.
It comes down to peace, our individual peace. How do we give it to other people? Rather than have our own.
So it's funny because I always say that those who consistently want the world around them to be a certain way are the least at peace with themselves. And I've seen this in my life. Like when I've experienced the worst of it, I like want to try to control as much as I possibly can. And I'm happy. I'm much more likely to let things go. I'm like, oh, okay, I'll just go with the flow. So maybe it's also a psychology lesson. But
Thank you for sharing with us.
Yeah.
thank you.